Hello everyone and welcome to Words on Wednesday, our online Bible study, where we're looking in quite a bit of detail at Saul who became Paul, and in particular Paul as an apostle to the Gentiles, so someone who was sent to people who weren't Jewish. And Gentiles, as we learnt last week, were not just not Jewish, but also included a whole host of people, including the pagans. And Paul uses that phrase of himself. So the whole point for Paul was that everybody needed to hear the good news of the God of Israel, who was creator and is creator of the world. And he believed that the Gentiles would be blessed according to the particular Jewish hope that Paul cherished, when and only when Israel's God had fulfilled his promises to and his purposes for Israel. And Paul believed that this had already happened in the person of Jesus Christ, the Jewish Messiah, through his life and his death and his resurrection. So today we're going to be introduced to one of Paul's most crucial, but also one of Paul's most controversial technical terms. So I don't know whether you're ready for all of that. I hope you are. You might listen to this maybe a few times before you get your head round it. But this controversial technical term is basically translated to mean the righteousness of God. So you'll have heard that phrase before, but what exactly is Paul meaning when he says it? So although I'm going to be building on this idea during this video, we are going to give it some meat to the bones next week when we look at some biblical passages, and also look at another term, justification, which is also quite difficult for us to get our heads round as well. But for now, the righteousness of God. So the first thing that we need to really get our heads around is that we need to be aware that Paul writes in Greek, and he's got all this information in his head, all this experience. He is a faithful follower of the Jewish way. So although he's writing in Greek, he's got the whole of sort of the Hebrew scriptures in his head as well, in his head and in his heart. So by the time we get to it in an English translation, well, we just need to be really mindful that our English translation might not necessarily be 100% accurate, and scholars have debated the actual meaning of these words for just generations and generations and generations. So I think my sort of aim is to just summarise some of this and try and simplify it so that you can understand it in more of a practical kind of way when you're reading scripture. So we've got the whole thing with language. So when Paul uses the term righteous, it also means just. So righteous and just, righteousness and justice. So in a sense, these two words can be, but not necessarily are all the time, interchangeable. So we need to be very aware that Paul is writing in Greek, and our English language is, well, it's not the best in the whole world, is it, when it comes to trying to get the original meaning from centuries and centuries ago for modern hearers. So the righteousness of God, if I was to say this to you now, like I just have done, what would you think it means? What's the first thing that pops into your head when you hear that phrase? Now, it occurs 8 times in Paul, 7 of which are in Romans. But its meaning is quite drastically obscured in various translations, not least in Romans 3, verses 21 and 26. If you read the NIV version, Paul's meaning, well, he means at least two quite different things when he uses this phrase in the space of just 6 verses. So let's just have a little bit of historical background then, shall we? The reader of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Jewish scriptures, the righteousness of God would have one obvious meaning. It would be God's own faithfulness to his promises. And that would echo Isaiah 40 through to 55 in the aspect of God's character, because he saves Israel despite Israel's sin. So you've got this notion of a God who has made promises, and Israel can trust that God will keep those promises. So God's righteousness in this regard is trustworthiness, but it's also linked to Israel's salvation on the other. God's trustworthiness, Israel's salvation. And at the heart of that picture in Isaiah, there stands, of course, this strange figure of the suffering servant through whom God's righteousness, his righteous purpose, is finally accomplished. Now, there are many, many other passages which support the reading of God's righteousness. For instance, that great prayer in Daniel 9, you might want to read that. So none of this is particularly controversial. In the Septuagint, the phrase means most naturally God's faithfulness. Faithfulness to his covenant with Israel. And as a result of that faithfulness, he saves her from exile in Babylon. So this covenant through which he will address and solve the problem of evil in the whole world is plain to see. However, righteousness is a really forensic term as well. So we need to look a little bit deeper about the other connotations that God's righteousness actually has. So the term is actually taken from a law court. So if we approach it like this, we need to understand what a Hebrew law court actually is, what it looks like. Well, there are 3 main characters in a Hebrew law court. There is the judge, and then you've got the plaintiff or the person bringing the accusation, and then you've got the defendant, who's also called the accused. So in the Jewish biblical law, there are those 3 parties: judge, plaintiff, defendant. So what does righteousness mean in that context? Well, it means something quite different when applied to either the accused or the accuser, the defendant and the plaintiff. If it's applied to the judge, it's clear from the Old Testament that the judge must try the case according to the law, that the judge must be impartial, he must punish sin as sin deserves, and must support and uphold the vulnerable. Now, for the defendant and the plaintiff, the accuser and the accused, to be righteous has none of those connotations. They are, after all, they're not trying their case. For them, to have the term righteous in the biblical sense within the law court setting is for them to have that status as a result of a decision made by the judge. So righteousness of the judge is very different to the righteousness of either the plaintiff or the defendant, the accuser and the accused. So the judge upholds the plaintiff. If the judge upholds the plaintiff, the accuser, then he or she is right. They are righteous. Now, this does not mean that they're morally upright or really virtuous. It simply means that in this case, the judge, the court, has vindicated him or her in the charge they have brought. And it's the same for the defendant as well. If they are acquitted, they are deemed righteous. That's the result of the case for them. But the problem that we have is in the English word righteous, because it's got all these moral overtones, hasn't it? But it means biblically the status they have when the court finds in their favour. Righteousness in a biblical setting is the status that they have once the court has found in their favour. And if we're going to be building on this idea of us becoming righteous and God's righteousness, we need to understand that in this biblical setting. Now, all this is really, really important to Paul. If we use the language of the Hebrew law court, it makes no sense whatsoever to say the judge somehow transfers his righteousness to either the plaintiff or the defendant. Do you understand what I'm saying? Righteousness is not an object that can be passed across the courtroom. For the judge to be righteous, it does not mean that the court has found in his favour. That's not how the language works in this sense. So what happens if we put the covenantal meaning of God's righteousness together with this metaphorical idea of the law court? God is, of course, judge. Israel comes to plead before him, to plead against the wicked pagans who are oppressing them. Israel longs to be justified and vindicated. God is righteous. God is the one who makes the judgment. God is judge in this case. And so if and when God does act, his people will, metaphorically speaking, have the status of righteousness. But the righteousness they have will not be God's own righteousness, because God's own righteousness remains God's own property. The righteousness that they receive in this sense is because the court God has found in their favour. So that's all pretty confusing stuff, isn't it? But how often do we just read our scriptures and think we know what it's getting at, but really we have got none of the background? And this is just really a simplified kind of understanding, and even this is really complicated. So this is really the background, the God of Israel, a God of righteousness, God's righteousness. We need to understand that before we can look to see what Paul is trying to say about where Christ fits into all of this. So next week, we're going to look at God's righteousness in Paul's letters. So if you could read Philippians and 2 Corinthians and the whole of Romans, then that would be really helpful. And then once we've got our head round righteousness, we're going to try and get our head round justification as well. So I hope you've enjoyed, if that's the right word, this little video. And you might want to just have a bit of a rest now. So take care, everybody. God bless, and we'll speak really soon.